two Indians can meet on the street, not know each other, and they can exchange QR codes and exchange 1 rupee instantaneously from one bank account to another with no fee. And you're stuck with Venmo and PayPal because God forbid you should have seamless fintech. Agriculture in India is not going to be viable. It's going to be too hot to farm. We have to invest in adaptation and resilience because otherwise a lot of people are going to die. I always like to say venture is a river. When we launch new funds, people are like, give us your pipeline. And then 6 months later, they're like, why did the pipeline update so much? It's like, because I'm not a buyout fund. Because the thing that is raising at that stage has either raised or died. And it's a constant flow. Like venture is about flow. It's all about people. Back brilliant people who want to change the world. It's all about the people you hire in your firm. It's all about the entrepreneurs you back. It's all about understanding who people really are. And I think that's the secret to success.
Over 83% of you that listen to or watch this show regularly haven't yet subscribed to this show. So could I ask you for a favor before we start today? If you like the show and if you like what we do here and you want to support us, the free and simple way that you can do just that is by hitting the subscribe button or following us on your podcast app. It helps this channel more than you know. Thank you and enjoy this episode. Mark, thanks so much for doing this with me today. Thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here, Scott.
I want to start with something that might seem tangential to you, but I promise it connects. You grew up in Houston, Texas, in what you described as an immigrant-heavy neighborhood. Most people don't make the connection between childhood environment and building a $300 million venture fund focused on Indian agriculture decades later. So walk me through that. What was your early life growing up in Houston like? Tell me about your home environment, about your parents, who they were, and what kind of conversations were happening around your family dinner table?
My parents were both educated professionals. My dad was a doctor who worked in a rural community outside of the city. And my mom had various jobs when I was a kid, but in her late 30s actually went back to law school and became a criminal defense attorney doing largely capital murder cases in Texas, which is a pretty interesting and ambitious thing to do. I think my family home was always characterized by a pretty intellectual dinner table. We were the kind of family that talked about the news, debated the news, 3 newspapers delivered every day. It was an interesting environment to grow up in. My mom probably drove that even more than my dad, who worked constantly. But one of the things is when I was an elementary school student, my mother would lay the New York Times out in front of me and make me read it to her while she was making my breakfast. There was a certain element of curiosity that drove my early life, curiosity about the world. One of the ways that manifested in my teenage years was we were not a very television heavy family. We were a PBS family. So I think like early cultural influences on me, it's kind of weird, oddly influenced by things like William F. Buckley and Firing Line and the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour. You hear this about me, you're like, oh God. But the good news that got me away from all of that obsessive bookishness was I got a shortwave radio as a kid and started listening to news from all over the world, to the BBC, to the Voice of America, and kind of just became obsessed with the idea of what was happening globally. The counterpoint for all of this was growing up in Houston, a very heavily immigrant city. So a lot of people, when they think of immigrant cities in America, they think of LA, they think of New York. Houston is actually more diverse than either. It is a city with one of the largest, obviously a massive Hispanic population, very large Asian population. And my encounters with that go back to even grade school. I was friends with lots of kids from India, from China, Iranian refugees, lots of kids whose families were from the Middle East, lots of Latin kids. I had this sort of intellectual interest in the world, but I also had this very physical, very intimate set of relationships in my life with people, none of whom had parents that were born in the US. And that sort of clicked pretty early on. I think probably notably through food. I can tell the story in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I've told people like the first time I ever had pani puri, which is a really authentic Indian snack, was maybe as a 10-year-old. Another way to tell the story is a lot of people, when they get a car, Houston is a sprawl city. It's an edge city. If you don't have a car, there is no public transit to really speak of. And so it's very, very common as a high schooler in Houston to save up your money and get a car. And lots of people, when they got a car, the first thing they would go do is go to the movies or go to a house party or what have you. The first thing I did when I got a car was go through the entirety we had an alternative news weekly in Houston. It's sort of the equivalent of the stuff Jonathan Gold was doing in LA. I went through the entirety of the ethnic food listings and reviews over the course of the last 2 years of high school. Every hole-in-the-wall Syrian restaurant or tiny taqueria that no one had ever heard of. That sort of perspective, the intellectual perspective of being very kind of news-obsessed and spending a lot of time in the 90s. If you had asked me to speak 2 hours extemporaneously on the Bosnian War in 1994, I probably could have. At the same time, being this obsessive, people weren't called foodies back then. That culture of reviews didn't exist. And so we relied on experts and food reviewers. But the alternative news weeklies kind of drove awareness of these out of the way joints. I was just very much like a young person desperate to get out who wanted to see the rest of the world and experience it as soon as humanly possible. So if you want to connect that to the present, that's what drives me to India as a young person. That's what drives me to backpack in all sorts of places. That's what drives me to intern out of the country. That's what drives me finally to leave America in 2006, basically with no intention of ever going back.
You've mentioned somewhere that you had early exposure to the ABCD community, which is the American Born Confused Desi.
I don't think it's as popular a term as it was 20 years ago, but it's still spot on.
Explain what the ABCD community is. And were you conscious of this as a cultural exposure?
A cultural dynamic. India is a country of acronyms. You get used to it eventually, but there are a lot of acronyms used constantly in daily life. And so around that time, there were a variety of acronyms to describe the diaspora. So the official term of the diaspora in India is the NRI, the non-resident Indian. And the community itself designed these other terms. There was a term of ABCD, American Born Confused Daisy. There was a term which was not as polite of FOB, fresh off the boat. And so the ABCDs were these kids who had been born in America to their Indian immigrant parents. It was a term that I associate with like the early 2000s. I think there even was a movie called ABCD. Their parents were mostly educated professionals. And it sort of spoke to the confused bit was this sort of tension between what life was supposed to be like as a young American and what life was like in an Indian immigrant household that had brought values from the motherland back home. Did I perceive this amongst the Indian American kids that I knew? I mean, I perceived, in every immigrant community, mine included, there is a tension between a traditional culture and a modern reality. And so I saw that with my friends who were Chinese. I saw that with my friends who were Persian, and the Indians were no different. So I didn't necessarily perceive any uniqueness to that, rather just the same as with most immigrant communities that have kept their culture and cherish it, a tension between that and the homogenizing effect of American popular culture in that era. Especially, I think, in these days, in the social media era and beyond, you're sort of better able to keep to yourself, to the things that you like or that represent you when you're consuming culture. But if you think about America in the 80s and 90s, that was bloody impossible. There were 4 television stations, a couple radio stations. You were consuming truly mass culture in an uncustomized way. I definitely saw that tension.
Around 1996 or so, you were off to the University of Pennsylvania, where you graduated with honors and inducted in a Phi Beta Kappa. Why U of Penn, and what did you study when you went there?
Did economics and history. And why U of Penn? Honestly, I know there are lots of people that love their alma mater, and I fucking hated Penn.
Why?
It was the worst idea to go to that school. Why did I go there? I wanted to go to a good school. I wanted to move into an even more urban environment, which is interesting for someone who then later had a career in agriculture. I didn't want to go to Columbia because my cousin was there and she was close in age to me, and our mothers are twins, and I felt I would have no privacy. I didn't want to live in some random place like rural New Hampshire. Didn't want to go to Dartmouth. And so I was like, it seems like this will be a good place. And I just hated it. I had a wonderful time in graduate school at Harvard, and I hated almost every second of Penn.
What didn't work for you at U of Penn?
Penn was almost achingly pre-professional. If you are 18 years old and you want to be an investment banker, bro, there's something wrong with you. I'm sorry. I don't know what to tell you. But if at 18, your goal is to work at Goldman Sachs, man, you never had that youthful idealism at all. You were just, that was what you wanted. You wanted to make pitch decks and beg CEOs for business. I don't know where to start with that. I didn't like the people. I didn't like the environment. I didn't necessarily love the education I got, but I also just think I didn't know myself. I had come from a high school that was tiny, a public high school in Houston, very gifted and talented, but very small, maybe 100 of us per grade. And I went to this enormous impersonal university. And I don't think I had the self-awareness as a 17-year-old to recognize that I was making a horrible mistake. And that probably if I had gone to a Williams or an Amherst or a very small liberal arts college, that it would have been a lot closer to what I thought of as normal than just dropping into this campus of 20,000 people in West Philadelphia.
You got out of U of Penn, and then you started your career in 2001 as a strategy consultant at PFM, which I guess is an acronym for Public Financial Management. I guess they didn't spend a lot of time coming up with the name.
No, it was the worst, terribly branded firm that did fascinating work.
It almost sounds like a CIA front or something like that, But anyway, you were working in public finance advisory. So tell me how that job came about, what attracted you to it, and what you were doing there.
It was a really interesting firm. It was a firm that had been created by a lot of people that were part of the political scene in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. And I had gotten to know one of them when he was running for mayor of Philadelphia, an unsuccessful campaign, unfortunately. The firm essentially did, I would say, one very big thing and one very small thing, and I was part of the small thing. So the very, very big thing is they were the main advisors to state and local governments and hospitals, public utilities, when they were raising debt or restructuring or issuing bonds or what have you. It was a very policy meets finances meets Wall Street kind of job. I worked for a very small team there that advised state and local governments that had gone bankrupt or were near bankruptcy, and as well as occasionally people running for office that were tackling issues of budget deficits and government restructurings. And so in contrast to the bigger part of the firm, which was very Wall Street facing, we were much more politically facing. And so we got to work for elected officials that were in a bind and help them get themselves out of the problems they were in. And it was interesting. It was the early 2000s, 9/11 had just happened. And so there are all these people today who we engaged with back then who are quite famous, like Cory Booker when he was a city councilman, who's now the senator from New Jersey, and Tom Suozzi, who's a force to be reckoned with in New York, who probably should have been governor a long time ago and maybe one day will have the shot that he deserves. But it was like a job intensely rooted in politics, campaigns, and policy. Someone once said of our job that we had banking hours, consulting travel at government pay, which in retrospect was all true. But it was fascinating work.
What attracted you to that job? What did you think you wanted to do with your life at that time?
I was always interested in politics. I got this idea that I'd like to really understand how government works, how it pays for itself, and how you can fix it and make it better for people. This firm was kind of famous for that, at least in DC, at least in Philly, where I had gone to school. I took a job and my bosses were young and amazing and had all worked. One had worked for Clinton, was in the OMB. The other had been Ed Rendell's main lieutenant in his mayoralty and was advising him as he was the governor of Pennsylvania. And it was really interesting. If you ask, well, what happened? I completely burned out on American politics over a 4-year period. So I understand, I didn't like my university. I didn't like my first job. By the way, I've done the same thing for 20 years now. I figured out what I like. Okay. For 20 years, I've done ag and emerging markets, and it's been great. But yeah, there were some early mistakes in my life. I wouldn't actually say, I would say PFM was fabulous training. When I got to Harvard Business School, I think I came in with the modeling skills of a banker and the presentation skills of a consultant and the ability to work 100 hours without complaining. If you ask over a multi-year time frame, I kind of said, hey, this was great training. I do not want to be a politician in America. I do not want to run for office. I actually want to get the hell out of this country as soon as humanly possible.
It's good you got that out of your system early.
I got to business school and people were like, what do you want to do? And I was like, I want to leave this country. Like, that is my number one priority. My number one priority is to get abroad as soon as humanly possible.
The first school and the first job you didn't really like, but we all enter university around 17, 18 years old. I mean, you wouldn't hire a career counselor who's 18 years old. How the hell do you know what you want to do? And you only know by doing it. Anyway, you went off to Harvard Business School. What made you think to go to business school at that point in time?
What made me think I wanted to go to business school was a recognition that I wanted to, A, transition my career to something outside of the United States. Business school seemed to be something that would create a lot of optionality for me. Law school, obviously, you can't really do anything outside of the country that you're a lawyer in, so that was kind of off the table. Policy school seemed incredibly ridiculous because I had literally done the job that those people do after policy school out of my undergrad. And so I applied to a couple B schools and, got into a bunch, and Harvard is Harvard. I remember trying to decide between a few options, and a friend of mine told this very funny story. He was like, you know what? In a lot of schools, when the chairman of the Federal Reserve comes to campus, it's a big thing. They have him speak. They do a student event or something. You know what they call it when the chairman of the Fed comes to campus at Harvard? And I said, no, what? He said, Thursday. It's called Thursday.
You graduated as a Baker Scholar, which I guess that puts you in the top 5% of your class. And you have other compatriots who've done the same. Michael Bloomberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Jamie Dimon. So
they're all a lot wealthier than I am.
I hope you get to see them all regularly.
I don't think we have a club. I don't think there's a club of us.
Now, is this during Harvard when you had this internship at ITC?
I did a project for ITC during HBS that was sort of my first time doing work in India. I had been to India a bunch of times in a personal capacity and really loved it and was very interested in India as a possible place to work. The first time I ever worked there was for ITC. ITC had very famously done something called e-Chopal. E-Chopal was this social initiative of essentially working with smallholder farmers and building value chains that would help those smallholder farmers economically benefit. And those value chains in turn would economically benefit ITC in their Agri division. And this was a case that we actually read, that every first year at Harvard Business School read. And so I had read this case. I thought it was fascinating. And I basically asked a professor to connect me with the protagonist of this case, a guy named S. Shivakumar, and proposed that I do some stuff for them, and had a chance to do that. It's one of the most meaningful kind of experiences of my life because it was the first time that I actually got to work with smallholder farmers to understand agri value chains, really see the challenges of building a business in rural India. And honestly, I was hooked. I couldn't, survive on that salary, but it was a chance to get a first work experience there. And then it very directly translated into my decision 2 years later to join Godrej Agrovet in Mumbai.
So right out of HBS, though, you joined Syngenta and moved to my part of the world in Basel, Switzerland. Tell me how that came about and what you were doing there.
I had an opportunity to join Syngenta. There were very few agribusiness companies that recruited at HBS. At the time, like the hot jobs were like private equity or hedge funds or mostly consulting or what have you. I had sort of gotten this agri bug in my head. Some of that actually started before HBS. It started because I had done some work in the politics of California in the Central Valley. And that was really the thing that was like, oh, wow. Agri-food systems are interesting. Farmers are interesting. Rural development is interesting. So when I got to HBS and people were like, what do you want to do? Aside from get the hell out of the country, ag was one of the areas that I was thinking about very seriously, and that influenced internships and other things that I ultimately did. Obviously, as a second year, there weren't really a lot of ag companies that came to campus. Cargill had very famously left and decided never to come again, and I don't think they ever did, because they felt that they were not given the proper respect that they deserve because the students didn't want to work in the sector. But there was a kind of wizened elderly professor at HBS by the name of Ray Goldberg. And Ray, when we use this term agribusiness, he invented it. Like literally, it's the title of his 1954 dissertation called The Theory of Agribusiness. And he had been on the faculty at HBS for decades. By the time I met him, he was an emeritus professor. I got to know him. I did research with him. And in my second year, I basically said, hey, Ray, I would like to find a job in the sector where you are the grandfather of the sector. Ray had been on the board of ADM. He'd been on the board of Pioneer Seeds, Smithfield Foods, and other places. And basically, Ray was like, okay, I'll make some phone calls. And he did. And he made a bunch of phone calls, and I had job offers. I had interviews and job offers pretty soon at I want to say ADM, definitely ADM, Monsanto, which I wasn't going to join because Monsanto. I took the job at Syngenta and worked for a great bunch of people there. I loved Syngenta. I did not love Switzerland. Like, full disclosure. Where do you live in Switzerland?
I've always been based in Geneva. And you've lived in Switzerland. You know that the German-speaking part, the French-speaking part, and the Italian, these are all separate little countries.
I had a very good friend who worked in the intellectual property, kind of affiliated with WIPO
with WIPO,
in Geneva. And when I would go visit this guy, I was like, oh my God, this is so much more open and liberal and normal. And Basel, it's funny as a 47-year-old, because now I've been back to Basel many times. I don't have a lot of friends left at Syngenta, but I have a few. And when I go back, I'm like, this is so nice and it's lovely and it's so quaint. I was like 27. It was not fun. It was just too small. It was just too sleepy. It was just too Swiss. I don't think I had realized in my first kind of experience living abroad that there are some countries where, like, if you are a foreigner and you move there, your neighbors are like, welcome, please have dinner at my house 100 times in the next year. And Switzerland's not like that. Okay. I know people that have been in Switzerland 20 years and they have one Swiss friend, like one. That's it. Everyone else is not Swiss. After 2 years of like not knowing my neighbors, when the chance came to move to India, I was like, cool, I'm gone.
And that chance came about 2 years later, and you make what seems to be a pretty bold move. You leave Syngenta, and you relocated to India to join Godrej Agrovet. So tell me how that came about and what you went there to do.
When I was at HBS, I had gotten to become friends with one of my classmates, a woman by the name of Nisa Godrej. And Nisa came from an industrial family that had been in business in India in a big way for, at the time, 120, 130 years. I once described Godrej as like the Cabots or the lodges of India. We had actually been at Penn together. We had not known each other in those days. And very interesting, diversified conglomerate run by a family of honestly wonderful people where everyone is educated at Harvard, Penn, Columbia, MIT, or Stanford. Like, that's it. There's 6 schools you can go to. The whole family has gone to those 6 schools. Very honest and ethical and really wonderful people. Nisa and I had become friends. I had done a lot of India-related stuff while I was at HBS, and we had helped run an India conference together. I guess at some point in 2007, she was asked by her father, Adi Godrej, to work on fixing Godrej Agrovet, their agribusiness subsidiary, their ag division. They wanted to hire a head of strategy and business development, and I think I was the only one in our class who had gone into ag. And she knew that I had done stuff in India before and was pretty open to moving, and reached out, and I jumped at the opportunity and moved to India in January of 2008.
You spent about 6 years with them, so it must have been a time that you were learning a lot. At what point did you realize that you needed to try something completely different?
I joined and I worked for the CEO, and I also did a lot for Nisa, for the chairman, who was Nisa's uncle. And I spent about 5 or 6 years there. We turned around the company, did a lot of M&A, rebooted the research program, rebooted marketing, and along the way had this idea to launch a corporate venture capital fund. The history of Omnivore is we start out as a CVC, affiliated and kind of controlled by Godrej Agrovet. And I think over time, what sort of like 2 things became very clear to me. One was I probably wasn't going to ever be the CEO of that business. I am not Indian, probably don't know how to do the politics of being a CEO. It is not in my temperament or ethos. My favorite Steve Jobs quote that I use with startups, that I use with new joinees at Omnivore is, why join the Navy when you can be a pirate? And I love that quote because it kind of describes the ethos of the startup ecosystem and the people that back it. And I worked for the equivalent of a 4-star admiral who was a tremendous boss who I learned an incredible amount from and who I never could have done that job. What was required of in terms of temperament of that job. And so between that recognition, starting this CVC, the CVC taking off, and sort of realizing that I loved venture and I loved working with startups and I loved rolling up my sleeves and fixing early stage stuff when it was broken. And I hated corporate bureaucracy. And I hated the formality of the Indian corporate sector. It wasn't so much a frustration as oh, cool, I've kind of figured out what I want to do. And so in 2016, 17, we basically went to the family and said, hey, we want to kind of spin out and go raise money independently of an affiliation with you guys. And they were very gracious about that. We simultaneously had a couple of potential LPs that were chatting with us that said, we're super happy to back you, but we're not happy to back you if a chunk of you is owned by a corporate. And so between one thing and the other, we successfully spun out in 2017 and then, had a first close of our first independent fund in 2018.
What was the time frame that you actually started this up in-house, so to speak?
In-house, I think we started 2011.
Okay, so you had a number of years.
kind of operating as a CVC.
When you spun it out, what was your founding thesis that you saw that others were missing? And how did you convince LPs to give you money for this?
The founding thesis of the CVC was this idea that India has this enormous agricultural sector that's about 20% of its economy, and about 40% of the population lives in rural India, and nobody was innovating enough for the needs of that space. And traditional venture capital firms would not back any startups that were trying to solve problems in that space. The genesis was this, let's be catalytic capital and back entrepreneurs that are going to develop new technologies for Indian farmers. That is the thesis that goes back to 2011. And so we did that. We backed a number in 2012, 13, 14, and 15. We backed about 13 investments into very early stage companies that were working on new technologies for Indian ag. Thankfully, a lot of them did pretty well. And we were able to kind of show a track record. Two things happened. One was in 2013, there was a convening of the Indian Impact Investors Council inaugural meeting. We got an invite. We were very confused by this. We were like, we are a corporate VC focused on agriculture. Why are we here? And the guy who had founded the organization was like, well, you guys are a catalytic investor in a space that addresses the needs of a large demographic of vulnerable lower income people. And we went, okay. And so we started learning about impact investing back in 2013. And that sort of resulted in a project we did in 2014, led by Rehem Roy, who was then an associate and is now a partner with us, to map the impact that those first investments had made, which were, by the way, significant. And then another impact report that we made before we spun out, as we were planning to spin out, to say, look what we've done. Look at what these companies have done and what they've been able to do for farmers. That sort of put in our head this idea that what we were doing is very unique and very special. And that put us on the radar of potential LPs who later on were the first people to back us, like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Dutch Good Growth Fund, and KfW, and Kenny Arth. Those were the early people that sort of saw what we had done as a CVC and said, this is worth you guys scaling up and becoming independent. I don't think the thesis changed very much between the CVC days and the first fund. It changed more between between the 2018 fund and the 2023 fund than it did between the CVC and the 2018 fund.
But then the motivation to spin out of the company, was it no longer fitting, or did that function remain there and then you guys just split up?
It was a couple things. I think in 2013 or 14, when I started this out, I had two jobs. It's funny, I always say I was originally a venture partner in Omnivore. It says managing partner, and I was one of the two people that started it. But initially, I had two jobs. I had two business cards. I was an executive vice president at Godrej Agrovet and a venture partner at this new thing we were doing. And it eventually became clear that was not sustainable, that running a corporate VC was a full-time job. And so in 2013, I stepped down from my other responsibilities to just focus on the corporate VC. And fast forward a couple of years, it was kind of clear to us that as soon as I had left that having two hats, the value add that we were creating for the corporate had radically diminished. When I was no longer in executive committee meetings and all of this, that sort of had broken. We wanted to do stuff without so many constraints and so many requirements and so many vetoes and other things. And so it was clear to us from a governance perspective that we wanted to spin out. And I think from an economics perspective, almost all of the quote unquote carry was not for us. And so I think we were cool, we would like to put our own money in, have the risk, have the reward. And so it wasn't horrible dissatisfaction. It was also sort of a recognition that we had all of these LPs that had reached out to us that were we'll back you, but not if you're controlled over there and where all the carry is over there as well.
But the family had no problem that they were going to lose all the carry?
There were some debates, and I think for whatever reason, they were pretty gracious about it, and we spun out. The chairman continued in a personal capacity on our IC for many years. There was no bad blood.
I always have to ask, what's the story behind the name? And so what's the story behind the name Omnivore?
We tell the story two ways. There's the actual story and there's the joke. The actual story is that one of the books that really influenced my thinking about agri-food systems was Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma, which was written maybe in 2004 or 2005 when I was in business school. And I read it, devoured it, loved it, thought it was this incredible tome. It's still relevant. I think it's more widely known. But, America had not had a real debate about food systems until around the time that book came out. Like in the 1990s, when Britain is thinking about mad cow disease and frankenfood and no GMOs, America's like, oh my God, I love Hot Pockets. Woo, Pop-Tarts, right? Like there was no discussion about those issues in the US, not the same way that it had sort of filtered into the consciousness in Europe of your average citizen. And I think Michael Pollan's book was a trigger of the beginning of a much larger debate about how should we eat and how should we grow it. That continues to this day. In honor of that book, we named the fund Omnivore, and we actually wrote Michael Pollan to let him know we were doing this. I'm sure it was ridiculous to him. It's like 2011, and he's getting an email from a bunch of dudes he's never heard of on the other side of the world being like, we love your book so much we named a VC fund after it. But he was gracious and wrote back. The joke is, there are two of us who are managing partners at Omnivore, myself and a guy by the name of Janesh Shah. Janesh comes from the Jain, Jain community in India, which is an unusually orthodox community. It is not Hinduism. It is not Buddhism. It's older than both in some ways. And it's a very small community, largely mercantile, that has their own small faith and the strictest dietary laws in the world. Jains do not eat anything that is grown in the ground. They eat no meat, no eggs, no fish, and nothing grown in the ground. Potatoes, onions, garlic, ginger, carrots, none of those, because they are so overwhelmingly concerned about animal rights and the life of animals. And they feel that growing things in the ground, you're crushing bugs and causing devastation when you do that kind of agriculture. And Jains are probably the most focused on animal welfare of any people in the world. And so you've got one partner who's like that. And then you have me, who's never seen a steak tartare he didn't want to eat, or an oyster. If it is carnivorous, I love it. The joke all these years later is you take a hardcore herbivore and a hardcore carnivore together, and what do you have? You have an omnivore.
So I guess finding a suitable place for lunch is always a long discussion, huh?
No, it's not a discussion. We have a system. His dietary requirements are so strict that we will always go first to whatever place he's going to eat his salad, cooked veggies, or what have you. And then he will very politely sit there while I eat some, piece of an animal. He will not touch the water at that place. He will not eat the bread. He will just sit there very peacefully knowing. And we have decided a long time ago, the key to a happy business relationship is it's like, I'm not going to make you compromise and you don't make me compromise, but I'm not going to force my crap on you and you don't force your crap on me.
Were there any other runner-up names besides Omnivore?
Actually, no. I mean, we came to it pretty early.
So fast forward to today, paint me the 10,000 meter overview of what Omnivore looks like. How much capital are you managing? How many funds do you have?
We're currently managing the two kind of independent funds that we have, the fund from Vintage 2018 and Vintage 2023. The Vintage 2018 fund is $80 million. The Vintage 23 is $215 million, so $295 million in total. Team is split between Mumbai and Bangalore. There was a time where we had a bigger operation in Delhi, but we scaled it back. I spent a chunk of time in Dubai as well. About 20 of us in the firm, 3 partners, including 2 managing partners, a bunch of kind of senior investment personnel, a substantial back office, some really amazing venture partners and advisors that are part-time, but come from the senior-most levels of the agri world, of the climate world in India. And, whenever we talk about the fund, the easiest way to think about it is sector, stage, and geography. Geography is obviously India. Stage has evolved over time. When we were doing the CVC and when we did the first independent fund, we were very much a seed stage investor, like seeds, an occasional pre-seed, an occasional pre-series A, but really like seed. And when we made the jump from being an $80 million fund to a $215 million fund, I think we made the jump from seed to Series A occasionally doing a pre-A, and occasionally even doing an inexpensive Series B. So we've kind of gone into the space of early growth as an evolution, which, by the way, I'm very happy because I actually think the economics of seed to Series A has gone for a toss in the current market. I'm happy to not be writing lots and lots of small seed checks right now, and happy to be an anchor leading Series A check writer at a time where that's actually much more critical and catalytic. India is relatively oversupplied at the seed stage and undersupplied at the Series A.
Who are the LPs that have backed you?
Public LPs are like the IFC, FMO, BII, SIFEM in Switzerland, firms like Louis Dreyfus and Yara from the Agri space, Golding in Munich. I would say it's 90% foreign capital, 10% India. India, the big investor there is SRI, which is affiliated with the State Bank of India. 90% foreign investors, overwhelmingly Europe over the US, some in Singapore. It's an interesting LP base, very good LP base.
The returns you guys are targeting, is that just regular market VC?
We would describe it as we benchmark ourselves against our Indian venture capital peers. We want to be a financial first impact fund that delivers impact, but with financial returns in line with our regional peer group.
Well, let's talk about Omnivore's mission and the theory of change. And what is the specific problem you're trying to address with your investing activities?
So I would say 4 problems. I would say the thesis of Omnivore started, as I mentioned, with just this idea that Indian farmers are screwed. They don't make enough money. Their environment's falling apart. They don't have the right tools to deliver value to themselves and to consumers. And that was the original thesis. I think over time, our theory of change has evolved into 4 pillars: food security, agricultural prosperity, resource efficiency, and rural resilience. It's 4 different perspectives on the challenges in front of us. So there is the challenge of food security, which is a challenge of consumers and nutrition. And there's a challenge of agricultural prosperity. And again, remember, India has 1.4 billion people that need to be fed. So that food security challenge is not a joke. Then you have the challenge of agricultural prosperity, which is not looking at the farmer as a consumer. It's looking at the farmer as a producer and saying, okay, there's about 100 to 130 million farmers in India, which is about 600 million Indians with their families. And almost all of them are poor. Almost all of them are marginalized. Almost all of them barely make it through the end of the year financially. How can we fix that? How can we make it better? How can we make farmers more prosperous? And you need to think of every farmer. These are not charity cases. These are micro entrepreneurs. And how do we make these micro entrepreneurs succeed? Third pillar is resource efficiency, which is to say environment and climate. How do we solve the challenges, the environmental and climate challenges of Indian agriculture? How do we solve the water problem, the energy problem, the GHG problem, the overuse of toxic chemicals? How do we solve those problems? And finally, rural resilience. And when we say rural, you have to remember that India has about 100 to 130 million farmers, but the rural population in India is closer to 700 million people. That population has challenges that are linked to the challenges of agriculture but go beyond it. And so the rural resilience perspective is a lens that looks at households and says, how do we make these households more prosperous? How do we get them insurance? How do we get them credit? How do we get them things that will stabilize the rural household? And the MSMEs that dominate rural India, how do we make those MSMEs stronger so that they can grow and employ more people and create good jobs? And so, again, food security, agricultural prosperity, resource efficiency, rural resilience. And so we think that sort of comprehensively looks at the challenges of the agriculture, climate, and rural sector in India and points us in the direction of solutions that can meaningfully impact those challenges.
So you're working off of 2 funds, but I think in the history of Omnivore, you had 3 funds. Has your investment thesis evolved over the course from Fund 1 to Fund 2 and Fund 3?
I think our thesis has evolved insofar as Fund 1 was very only product companies, very much what a corporate venture capital fund would do. Very narrowly focused on product companies. And we made the jump beyond product companies to product companies, agri-related fintech, all of that, platforms and marketplaces. That jump was made in the 2018 fund. So that diversified. And then the jump from the 2018 fund to the 2023 fund was we're adding climate and rural in meaningful ways in addition to just purely looking at the agricultural sector. And the bigger jump was the jump of stage, which was saying that actually we would rather not mostly do seed rounds. We would rather mostly do Series A's and make exceptions to that sometimes.
Fund 3 is pretty focused on climate adaptation. I think you've said somewhere in my research, climate adaptation is gritty while mitigation is sexy. Why is climate adaptation the more urgent investment thesis for India's smallholder economy, and what makes it fundamentally different from mitigation?
Mitigation, right, is doing things that would reduce India's GHG footprint. And adaptation and resilience are doing things that will allow us to survive the climate crisis. I have two perspectives on that. One, mitigation is sexy because at least until recently, people thought that we were going to make great progress in it. And now America's left the chat. It is still urgent, but it's hard to ask people to do a lot of stuff on mitigation when you have large actors that have decided they just don't care about this. But I think the challenge of adaptation and resilience in India is just really this challenge of survival. Given that it doesn't seem like the planet's cooling anytime soon, and given that it looks like we're going to blow through every prediction of temperature increases, and given that we're sort of hurtling off the cliff, I think like we need to start building some parachutes rather than assuming that we're not going to hurtle off the cliff. In some ways, mitigation is very important. A number of our companies do good stuff on mitigation, but I'm a pessimistic person. For a VC, for sure, I'm not sure I have the temperament of the optimistic, futuristic VC. I'm the VC that sort of looks at the world and says, God, this has been getting continuously worse the many decades I have been alive. And so when you look from that perspective, and frankly, when you look at fucking reality in 2025, like we have to invest in adaptation and resilience because otherwise a lot of people are going to die. And agriculture in India is not going to be viable. It's going to be too hot to farm. And so these things are all very important.
I've got the high level strategy overview, but walk me now through your investment strategy.
If you look on our website, you'll see that there's sort of 4 business models where most of our deals fall into. And that's the reason we went from 6 to 4. We had 6 themes that were agri-food life sciences, precision agriculture, post-harvest technologies, farmer platforms and rural fintech, agri B2B marketplaces, and farm to consumer brands. And it was said, look, there's a lot of blurriness between the platforms and the marketplaces. And also, if we were to recast this in a way that we think, and by the way, fintech's very different. And so we actually recast those 6 themes over the last 2 years into 4 business models that are all very distinct that we think better captures where we invest. And so those 4 business models are, number 1, digital value chains, which is where we put the platforms and the marketplaces, these efforts to organize the agricultural and rural economy and the whole aspect of digitization, which India has been very successful with. That's one set of business models. And that's where you find companies like Dehat or Tractor Junction or Simplify or Agri or what have you. Then we've said, look, fintech is its own thing. It's not worth clubbing that with the platforms. And so we've said we have a space of inclusive and rural fintech where we invest. And that's where you find companies like Arya or Optimo or FinHot. And these are fintech models. Then we have what we call emerging technologies, which is our catch-all category where we put precision ag, post-harvest technologies, and agri-food life sciences. These are essentially science-based businesses. These are businesses that have technological risk as opposed to just operational risk. And that's where you find companies like Pixel making hyperspectral satellites, or Nico making, smallholder robots, or EcoZen making climate smart hardware for pumping, for irrigation and cold chain. Companies doing stuff in alternative materials like Altem and Fibmold, life science companies like Loopworm. We think that those business models are actually more similar than they are different. The way you iterate, the way you grow, your ability to exit. So that's a third theme. And then the fourth theme are sustainable brands. These are farm to consumer brands where we see someone building something that has to make consumers happy, but is creating a lot of value for the farmers that it's built value chains connecting. And that's where you see companies like Farmly or companies like more recently Sid's Farm. I think we'll probably do another 1 or 2 more sustainable agri brands over the course of the next year.
But a big part of your raison d'etre is to generate impact outcomes. So how do you balance in this overall strategy financial returns with impact outcomes?
Fundamentally, I'm investing, first of all, in the Indian economy, in a space dominated by people that are very poor. So if you ask me, do I have to make this trade-off? I don't recall a time where I've had to make this trade-off. We are a financial first fund, which means that if you gave me two deals, one deal which could impact, let's say, 1 million people, and one deal that does 10 million, and the million is going to make us a lot more money than the 10 million, we'll do the million every time. We have to, because not all of my LPs are impact LPs. But everything we do has to fit within the theory of change. And if it doesn't fit within the theory of change, we don't do the deal.
What would be an impact outcome that fits with all this, but that you would say no? For example, leapfrog, it has to affect X amount of people.
We have targets to reach a certain, which we're blowing through. But I would say that almost every deal we do is something that is going to have a large social or environmental impact, or we don't do it because of our sectoral focus. By definition, what can filter through that? Almost everything has a large impact. But if you're asking if it's a choice between one deal that is, a 70% IRR deal and another deal that's a 40% IRR deal, irrespective of the difference in impact, I will always do the 70% deal because I have a fiduciary responsibility to my non-impact LPs to do it.
Now, take me inside your actual investment process. How are you sourcing companies, and what kind of screening process do you run them through? And at what point do you have the conviction that this is something that you want to back?
It's venture. I always like to say venture is a river. It's very funny to me whenever people, like when we launch new funds, people are like, give us your pipeline. So we write the pipeline. And then 6 months later, they're like, why did the pipeline update so much? It's like, because I'm not a buyout fund. Because the thing that is raising at that stage has either raised or died, and it's a constant flow. Like venture is about flow. So if you ask me, how do we generally source? I'd say a couple things. One is do the same thing for 15 years and become ubiquitous with the space. So we've been doing the same thing for 15 years. We're pretty ubiquitous with the space. Our inbound is insane at this point. And I would say our inbound tends to be a large part of what we ultimately do. Our referrals are actually a big thing now, where we've backed enough companies who have backed enough founders who've been successful that they refer their friends who are starting up. I got a deal put on my lap about a week ago where the founder came and said, you've backed this friend of mine and that friend of mine, and they basically say you walk on water, so let's have a conversation. I think the third thing is we have a lot of partnerships with accelerators and universities and research institutes in India that give us a good sense of what is really the pre-seed stage more than the seed stage, so we can start seeing what's coming. And finally, occasionally we just deep dive spaces. Like we just say, look, I have a lot of conviction about something. We go meet all the people. So right now we have a conviction about electrification of rural vehicles. And we're not sure if the right answer is to back OEMs that are making, say, electric tractors, or maybe what's more interesting, perhaps, is to just back the companies making the electric motors, because it's hard to decide between backing an upstart tractor company or the fact that maybe the big OEMs are just going to dominate that space. And so if you can do the motors, you can do anything. We sometimes develop theses, and right now we're running around trying to meet every electric motor company in India.
What about the way you screen these?
The filter is it has to fit into the theory of change, or we don't touch the deal. Like if it doesn't fit into the theory of change, we don't touch the deal. And then it's a very classic venture capital 4 T's. Team, TAM, tech, traction. Team, do you have founder market fit? Are these the right people to build for this space? Do they have the right work experience, the right education, the right networks, the right temperament for what they are building? In reality, it's the first, second, and third thing we care about. The next thing is TAM. Is this space big enough to be interesting? And a lot of people get TAM wrong. TAM is an acronym of total addressable market. The point in TAM is just to say, are you building in a potentially large enough space to generate a venture outcome that matters? So if someone comes to me and says, I have this super cool startup in an industry that in India that is $10 million in size, I cannot do. I mean, unless I think that 10 million is going to become a multi-billion dollar industry, I don't think I can do much there. That happens occasionally. To give a non-impact sense of it, like 10 years ago, did you know what a stable coin was? Because I sure as hell didn't. Okay. But that's a space. And it's very funny. Harry Stibbings has this great podcast, The 20-Minute VC. And he was talking about the problem with TAM is if something is actually brand new, there is no TAM. But there were proxy TAMs for what stable coins could be. Money is a big TAM. And so I think it's important to not overthink the TAM. It's essentially a good yardstick for, are you building in a big enough space to be interesting? And then the third thing is tech, and that's really about either actual intellectual property or the uniqueness and defensibility of a business model. And then finally, traction. And traction is always very relative. It's traction relative to the money you've raised. It's traction relative to the time you've been around. You can see a company that's 3 months old and it has crazy traction because it's signed 5 clients. That might only be, I don't know, $10,000 worth of revenue per month. But that's a lot of traction for a company that's 3 months old. Whereas, you could see a company that's doing $10 million, and if you see it's 20 years old, it's not very interesting.
Let's talk about how you measure impact. You have something that you refer to as the Impact Measurement and Management Framework, IMM, which I guess is different than Bridgespan's IMM. Explain this framework, what it is and how it works, and how do you determine the link between the solution and the impact?
So the first thing is that when we're investing in a company, we try the same way as we're projecting financials, we're projecting the impact that something will have. So we're thinking from the very beginning, does this fit into our theory of change? What are the metrics we think it's going to drive? And can we have a projection of what those will be? And that's part of the the first investment memorandum that we write on the company. And then going forward, we measure the impact the company has created. We have an impact policy. It's listed on our website. Originally, it was 13. I think now it's closer to 20 metrics that we care about, that we track. And you can be like, but what about this other thing you haven't thought about? And it's like, that's cool, but here are the 20 we track. This is where we see significant we don't want a different framework. We want things that add together nicely across the portfolio to tell a story. So we have these things that we have decided are the things we will track. We do not do bespoke one-off measurements. We have these things for our fund. And then we essentially, for the purposes of determining impact, we do 3 things. One is we heavily rely on very strong MIS systems that we help our company build. 2, we do farmer or MSME surveys in the style of lean data without paying 60 decibels, too much money for it, that effectively do statistically significant surveys to determine, impact averages that we can then apply to that MIS data and extrapolate them. And finally, sometimes there's a good amount of research on the actual way of calculating the scientific formulas of GHG, fertilizer reduction, these kinds of assumptions that are rooted in the physical world that aren't about surveys, but rooted in the actual physics of certain things or the chemistries of things that we then apply to that MIS data. And then we generate and publish a very transparent impact report. You can read the most recent ones on our website. And thankfully, it was a nice kudos to get. We've been at this for a long time. We have a lot of development finance funds, development finance institutions that back us. So we've been building our impact and ESG systems for really the better part of a decade. And we were the first fund in Asia to get a Blue Mark Platinum, which happened a few weeks back. We're on the leaderboard there and pretty happy to be.
Congratulations on that. Could you give me an example or two from your portfolio that kind of demonstrate your convergence theory and climate adaptation thesis that kind of make it real, everything you've just described about your investment approach?
If I were to give you a good example, DeHaat is a great example. It's the largest farmer platform in India. DeHaat runs a network of tens of thousands of retail points where they sell sustainable inputs to farmers, and then they buy back outputs from farmers and help them sell, and they provide farmer advisory. And so if you ask, how does this all come together from an impact perspective? One of our impact metrics is around economic value creation for farmers. We can survey farmers in DeHaat and calculate how much money DeHaat has saved those farmers in the cost of farm inputs and their cost of cultivation. We can also calculate the economic impact of the higher prices that DeHaat has helped those farmers realize for their produce. We can also calculate the climate impact in terms of adaptation of what DeHaat advises those farmers to do in terms of their farming practices, and how that has both impacts from a climate adaptation perspective and potentially a mitigation perspective. That's how we think about it.
Do you have one more?
We have product companies like EcoZen, which, make solar powered irrigation solutions, which reduce the usage of grid energy. And you know how much they've been used and you know how many are sold. And so it's very easy to calculate the energy savings of a lot of these things, or the reduced spoilage. What the other products they make are decentralized solar powered cold storage. And so you can say, this is the amount of units. Here's roughly the amount of produce that flows through them. Here's the amount of spoilage that was avoided because these products are in the market.
Do you have any particular exit strategy that you're targeting?
I think in India, we're blessed with a lot of options. It was funny. I was at a conference in Europe a couple of weeks ago, and I was mentioning that one of our portfolio companies is planning an IPO, and they're like, what is this thing that you say it is an IPO? I have not heard of this. Like, he was kidding, of course. The nice thing in India is that we're blessed with wonderful, well-regulated public markets. The best way I can describe it to someone, it's like America in the 90s. Remember America in the 90s when you could go public without a goddamn SPAC? India has public markets like that. It is not easy to get listed, and it is a well-regulated exchange, but they have not choked it to death bureaucracy the way the Americans have, such that it is people stay private forever, and then the only things that happen are these weird SPAC thingies that sort of short circuit the bullshit. So if you ask me, like, there's three paths to exit: strategic sales, secondary sales, IPOs. Strategic sales, we've sold portfolio companies to Nutraco, SHV in the Netherlands, to Sumitomo, to Mahindra, which is an Indian giant tractor company. Secondaries, we've done plenty of secondary sales where incoming investors are buying out part or all of our position. And then, first IPOs are coming up next year after that. You can definitely take startups public in India very successfully. It's one of those cases where outside investors don't realize how good public markets in India are. But you know who does? Steve Schwartzman does. Blackstone does. They're the most active private equity investor in our market. When they were doing a presentation in New York a few weeks ago listing the top opportunities of the next few years, India was their number 3.
You operate what you call a more than capital approach, where you leverage relationships and expertise beyond just writing checks. Explain, what does that mean in practice?
It means I hire people who know what the hell they're doing from the industries where we invest. So a great example here is our investment director in Bangalore is a guy named Abhilash Sethi. Abhilash helped build the precision agriculture team at Mahindra before he joined us in 2018. So when Abhilash works with companies in the hardware space or in satellites or in robots, he spent many years working in those spaces at Mahindra. Our approach is to hire people that really understand the sector, can add a lot of value to the portfolio companies, and we want to be that 3 a.m. phone call. We want to be the VC that actually can add value. I know Vinod Khosla gets up there and says, most VCs destroy value. And it's like, sure, dude, accept you. But and I agree, I have worked with VCs that add negligible value in deals. Now, Omnivore is good when the chips are down. Omnivore is good when people are shooting. I'm very proud of the team that we've built and our ability to help our portfolio overcome adversity and to help the best portfolio companies reach their full potential. That's the fun thing in this job.
You've developed something you call the AgriTech agribusiness convergence theory. Somewhere in my research, I found a quote. You said that every agritech company grows up to look like an agribusiness company. And if you don't see the path to doing that, you're probably screwed. Unpack that for me. Tell me why founders must embrace becoming what you call a digitally native, very boring agribusiness company.
That statement is a reaction to what happened in the US starting in, say, 2011, and in India maybe starting in 2018, which is people got really excited about marketplaces and platforms and this whole effort to digitize agriculture, which is cool. But if you don't have good unit economics and a good cash conversion cycle, you are really not going to be okay. And too many people with too much VC money grew out businesses where the economics of what they were doing was not that interesting, not that sustainable, and those businesses fell apart. Thankfully, we've been through this terrible winnowing period where the people that have come out on the other side have fixed their economics and fixed their cash conversion cycles and are still growing. But I think it's very important for most people to understand that agriculture is a terribly traditional industry. And so if you're building a startup in it, which is great, you are using capital to grow much faster than everyone else, you still have to ultimately look like something that logically belongs in that industry when that capital stops coming in and you either sell yourself to a large corporate or IPO. And secondaries are an interim step to one of those two things. Given that needs to make sense either to the public markets or to an ultimate acquirer, you should understand what you're going to look like when you grow up. And it's just something that I think a lot of founders don't think enough about while they're in that blitzscaling early phase.
When you started Omnivore around 2011, there was maybe a handful of agritech startups in India. Now there's, I think, over 1,500. What's changed?
Success begets success. I would say a couple things. One, there were some things that got big that convinced other people to start up. Two, there is generally more talent in the startup space in India than there was 10 or 15 years ago. Once upon a time in India, the most prestigious careers for young MBAs, was, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, Unilever. These days, the best and brightest in the MBA class go into growth stage startups or even early stage startups because they understand that they're going to get much more opportunity, have much more fun, and potentially make much more money, even if there is an added element of risk. So I think we have better talent than ever before. I think You've had a situation where you have some trailblazers that have convinced other people that this is a big space to build in. And then I think the third thing is just very environmental, or actually there's two ways of answering that question. One is environmental in the sense that there has been groundwork that has been laid between public and private infrastructure in India that facilitates some of this. Private infrastructure, insofar as our 4G connectivity and 5G connectivity is better than America. Okay. That's one of the funny things about going back home is it's like, great, first world country, third world infrastructure. American airports are even worse. And then also India has these incredible digital public goods, this digital public infrastructure, whether you call it the India stack or the UPI. Like I try to explain this to my American and European friends, right? Like two Indians can meet on the street, not know each other, and they can exchange QR codes and exchange 1 rupee instantaneously from one bank account to another with no fee. And you're stuck with Venmo and PayPal and whatever nonsense exists because God forbid you should have seamless fintech and the ability of people to transact between accounts. Like this whole thing around stable coins. If America had the UPI, they wouldn't need a stable coin.
You just mentioned Blackstone being a player in the Indian market. Has there actually been Indian AgriTech IPO?
Not yet. Hopefully, first one later this year or next year. There are a couple things that are in the works. The first year the space raised any money was 2018. Since money started really coming into this space, there are not a lot of things that IPO in 7 years. Very few.
You've argued kind of forcefully today that VCs who overlook India effectively are leaving money on the table.
It drives me nuts. I will fight people on this. I once sat in a conference room in Germany, and there was a very lovely German pension manager on the other side of the table. And it was in the spring of 22 in the Ukraine war. And he was lecturing me on how risky India was. Like, India is so risky. It's risky. He kept saying risky without telling me why it was risky. I looked at him and I went, you just spent the last 3 decades running your economy on Russian gas and Chinese exports. And you want to tell me India's risky? And he leans back in his chair and goes, yeah, touche. The second anecdote is a few weeks ago at the Drop, this climate conference in Malmö. There was a discussion of GPs and LPs, and there was sort of an opportunity for people to say what was on their mind. And I stood up and I said, I've chatted with many of you in this circle, and I've asked you about your allocations. And, it's 70% US, 30% Europe, no emerging markets. You guys are climate LPs with a 70% allocation to Trump land. How do you feel today?
And the response?
5 people after that meeting came up to ask about our next fund. It was great.
So make the case. Why should more global capital be flowing into Indian AgriTech right now?
The case of India is the largest, fastest growing economy in the world that is reaching a point of inflection of true takeoff, that is competitive in so many industries, exporting to so many countries. US trade stuff will get figured out. That is a great partner for intellectual property, that doesn't partner with you and then create a rival factory 3 weeks later like China. That has an English-speaking diaspora, British common law. India as a case makes a tremendous case for itself. Whenever people talk about the challenges of India, usually they went to a wedding 30 years ago and maybe got sick in Delhi, or they were an investor in the late 90s and they talk about, it's hard to get out money and these things were fixed many decades ago. But some people still have long memories. I think India is an absolutely phenomenal place to invest in startups because we have liquid public markets that are accessible for exits and a huge capital stack from the seed to the Series A, Series B, all the way down. It's one of those things, like if you want to jump into a pool, look who's swimming there. Who's swimming in India? Excel. Probably the best generalist fund in India is Excel Partners from California. So it's always funny to me when I'm speaking to some like family office in the States that's like, I don't know how to think about this. I'm like, Steve Schwartzman thought about this for you. Some of the biggest money in the world is there. And then if you ask me to like make the case for AgriTech, basically 40% of the Indian population is on farm, 20% of the GDP. It's a space that is not slowing down. India has the potential to be a smallholder version of Brazil. It has the potential to double or triple its productivity without deforestation, without setting the Amazon on fire. It has the ability to create value chains that benefit small farmers. So it's not like West Africa where the cocoa industry is basically slavery. You have strong rule of law. You have strong investor protections. It is a no-brainer destination. It's beyond the point of saying it's an emerging market. It's just a logical bet. You know, one of the wonderful things in India, there's zero political disagreement about climate. The left and the right in India, they both know it's getting hot. They both know they have to do something about it. There's not this bizarre American debate which, you know, where two parts of the country are like a married couple that's not only not speaking to each other, that's actively lobbing grenades on the other side of the person's room. India, for all of its political challenges, is actually a country that is radically unified around the idea of its own worth and its own development.
You're focusing now heavily on agri-food life sciences, and this is a very different beast from something that people know about, maybe better digital platforms. This has longer timelines, more capital intensive, more regulatory risk. Why are you so bullish on life sciences right now? And what's the talent bottleneck you're seeing in India?
So we're bullish on life sciences because you can't solve the climate crisis purely digitally. Like, you have to do stuff that affects chemistry and biology, inputs, output processing, all of that. But I do think Indian startups are built differently. A great example is we have a portfolio company, Loopworm, in the insect protein space. Insect protein is fairly infamous right now because French startups set billions of dollars on fire trying to do insect protein with, you know, nothing to show for it but scared, frustrated investors in bankruptcy. And we have a portfolio company in India, Loopworm, that built their first facility for 400,000 euro. And are rapidly approaching cash flow positivity. Indian founders are built differently. They build leaner, they commercialize faster, and they oftentimes do, right, a beta version of what they eventually want to do while they're figuring out the regulatory part of the more complicated thing. There is a priority that is put on monetization in India that is unlike any place I've ever seen in the world. And so I don't think it's as risky as, you know, doing life sciences in Boston. There is a talent bottleneck, which is to say India historically, if we go back 3 decades, if you were a bright computer engineer, you graduated college in India, moved to the States for an advanced degree, stayed there. That started changing around the year 2000 in India, and now the best and brightest software engineers stay in the country. It was for a while very prestigious for MBAs, once they finished their MBAs, to go abroad. Not so prestigious anymore. I wrote an article or commented on this a couple of years ago that the American dream is good and dead for Indians. And by the way, that's probably a blessing for India because all of those people that helped build Silicon Valley are staying put and building it in India. But in the life sciences, it is still the case that postgraduate education, so you do your undergrad in India, but then all of the really great places to do postgraduate education are in the United States, in California, in Massachusetts, in the UK. And so there is still an exodus of life sciences talent, not so much in other spaces, certainly not in engineers anymore. And that creates, you know, a bit of a talent bottleneck in the life sciences ecosystem. The good news is A, that started changing a couple of years ago because people began to see the opportunity in life sciences in India. And B, thanks to increasingly strict immigration policies in the West, a lot of those people aren't going to leave in the first place anymore, or are deciding to come home. Like, we back a company, AltM, okay, that is building a sustainable materials platform, converting agricultural waste into alternatives to petrochemicals. One guy went to Berkeley as a graduate student. The other guy went to MIT. They spent 5 years at Tesla, and they got so sick of being treated like indentured servants by the H-1B program that they said, screw it. Let's go home and build in a place where we actually are respected. You could say it's a good example for America to learn from, but that's not going to happen.
I think we're not in the learning phase right now.
No, not so much.
You sit on the investment committee for the Climate Resilient Africa Fund. You're thinking deeply about how the playbook that you've built in India does or doesn't transfer to other emerging markets. What's the single biggest thing that doesn't translate? What has worked for you in India that you think won't work when you try to apply it in Africa or Southeast Asia?
The Indian diaspora is very unique, very global. And I think Indians tend to be plugged into very strong networks in the UK, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And that facilitates the growth of their companies. That facilitates capital accumulation. India has some of the greatest engineering schools in the world. And I think when you go to Indonesia, it's a great country. It's a big market, but you don't necessarily have the same level of talent. How many Indians are running Fortune 500 companies like the CEOs of Google and Microsoft and the World Bank? You don't really have that in other diasporas, and I think that will be a difference.
And what are the elements that do transfer well, and where do you see the greatest opportunity?
Digitization translates very well. The whole space of building farm-to-consumer food brands translates very well. The fintech thing transfers. I mean, African fintech is booming right now from folks like MoneyPoint. So I think many things will translate. I think there's a bit of a gap in terms of the highest level of talent.
You're skeptical of alternative protein for India, lab-grown meat.
Not just skeptical, it's just irrelevant for India.
This is a space, though, that's gotten a lot of buzz and a ton of capital globally. Why doesn't it make sense for India?
Because for starters, India is mostly a vegetarian nation. And I'm not saying that like every Indian is vegetarian. That's not at all true. Only 40% of Indians are vegetarian. But most Indians default to vegetarian meals. So even the meat eaters of India, many of Hindu meat eaters will oftentimes go seasons where they don't eat meat. There are times of the year called Shravan where the meat eaters of India, if they are practicing Hindus, will not touch meat. There are holidays where they will not touch meat. There are days of the week, every week, where they will not touch meat. So India is a country that doesn't consume a lot of meat. It's actually a country that needs to consume more meat because the Indian diet is wrecked by its over-reliance on carbohydrates, which is causing widespread diabetes and obesity in this modern era. So actually, India needs a lot more eggs and chicken than it has right now. And that's actually critical for the health of Indians in the long run. The whole thing about alternative protein in India is the worst version of a California to Bangalore copy paste. America consumes an insane amount of meat in a way that looks completely different than the Indian diet. The typical American meal is a piece of meat on the middle of a plate with a couple bits of vegetables around it. And India is the inverse. It is vegetables and vegetarian things with a little cup, a little katori, right? The little metal thing you see in an Indian restaurant of meat. It is such like first world projection to think that India needs to fix this, that this is a problem in India. And in fact, what India needs is to make eggs ubiquitous to solve the protein crisis in the Indian diet.
But isn't there opportunity for export?
That was really exciting. Like back in 2020, if you listen to me, I would say the same things about the diet, but I'd be like, but we're happy to supply the booming plant-based protein business in the US. We're happy to set up bioreactors in India much more cheaply than you can set them up anywhere else in the world and supply the booming cellular. Well, neither of those things are booming anymore, let's be clear. That whole space has fallen apart. Part of it's fallen apart because the science never worked out on the cellular and, a fermented space. And maybe that will eventually. But the other reason why it's fallen apart is that consumers don't like the products. They'll buy them once, they'll try them, their kids don't like them, they won't repeat purchase. That space has shrunk radically. We can put a ticker up of the Beyond Meat stock price. I understand why that space took off. It took off because there was sort of this idea that it was a panacea. We're going to give people a meat analog and it's going to taste exactly the same and they're going to decide they want that instead of this bad thing they eat. That thing they eat is something that human beings have eaten for millennia, okay? And these other things you're selling them are artificial garbage. I am sympathetic to the idea that we should not raise so many cattle in America to make low-end hamburgers in fast food chains. That could make sense, but the reality is, like, consumers didn't agree with that.
There's some things, though, that have never been obvious to me. Why to try to duplicate the taste of meat when a lot of people don't like that? Maybe the reason why this hasn't really taken off is they just haven't come up with something that really is good tasting.
Or it was good tasting, but it was terrible for you. I actually think this space will come back. There's always this thing of the Gartner's hype cycle. I'm never going to be optimistic about it in India because I think it's completely stupid from a sociocultural perspective. I do think in the US you could see a resurgence. It's just probably not in this era where climate is a dirty word. States are literally banning this stuff because they're kind of MAGA empowered.
In India, you got things like farm welfare that are linked to price controls and minimum support prices, fertilizer subsidies. And I guess some of these policies made sense a while back, but now sometimes they're creating perverse incentives. What's broken about the current system and what would better agricultural policy look like?
I think it's one of those things where what was very, very necessary once upon a time is no longer necessary in the same way. So a lot of the things that mess up Indian agriculture are Green Revolution era programs that never had termination clauses. The success of the Green Revolution, which was tremendously successful because India stopped having famines and stopped having to be dependent on imports. Farmers got wealthier and the whole country has grown for decades without really importing. There is a price to be paid for continuing programs that were designed to catalyze that when you no longer need it. And so India designed a series of things: fertilizer subsidies, minimum support prices, government procurement, free power and water, that have created an environmental catastrophe and a variety of moral failures, market breakdowns as a result, but it's politically like a third rail to get rid of those things. If you ask me what would fix that, we have to decouple the desire to achieve farmer welfare with managing programs to deliver that welfare in what I can only and have for many years called a Rube Goldberg device of schemes and systems. If you want farmers to make more money, the nice thing about 2025 is they literally have a bank account, an Aadhaar number, universal payment interface. Let's decide what as a society we want to wire into their bank account. Do we want to wire $500 a year or $1,000 a year or $5,000 a year? We can now say, these are the farmers of India. We can do a direct benefit transfer into their bank account. The problem is that the people that administer all of these programs of fertilizer subsidies, fertilizer delivery, the dole, which in India isn't given in cash, but in, literally rice and wheat, nobody wants to break the system, A, because it's a lot of government jobs, and B, because it's only been in the last couple of years that it was possible to do this. But with direct benefit transfer, if we want to give a subsidy to farmers, we can put it in their bank account. We do not have to underprice inputs and overprice outputs and warp markets to do that. And on the flip side, if we want to give consumers money to buy subsidized food, we can literally give them money to buy subsidized food. But I think there's sometimes a case where bureaucracy perpetuates itself. No bureaucracy ever puts up its hand and says, yeah, we should be shut down. We're no longer relevant. Digital era, fintech era, you probably don't need us.
You've been doing this 15 years or so. What's the most important lesson you've learned about building a sustainable, scalable impact investing platform in India?
Back brilliant people who want to change the world and avoid people that aren't. It's all about people. It's all about the people you hire in your firm. It's all about the entrepreneurs you back. It's all about understanding who people really are. And I think that's the secret to success.
I've seen you quote Rudyard Kipling, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Why is that your mantra?
That is my mantra because it's true. I realize Kipling is one of these figures who is very controversial. And a couple of years ago, we would have said he was canceled. But I think it's one of the most important kind of poems in the Western lexicon, which of course speaks to a certain Victorian version of manhood, which actually, if you read it, is really a mantra for entrepreneurs and the people that work with them. There was an old quote, it ain't over till it's over. If I look 3 years into a fund, the things that I think are the winners 7 years later are not the winners. The things that I left for dead come back to life. The greatest moments of triumph aren't, and the greatest moments of tragedy aren't. And having that understanding, that's the cool thing about getting older. I don't like the wrinkles so much. I do like the fact that I have this certain zen. When the younger team members at Omnivore are like, oh my God, this happened. Have you ever seen this? Yes, third time. My third time seeing this. It's my third time. I've been through this before. This too shall pass.
I'm having a lot of deja vu with this whole AI thing right now. It really just comes back to the whole beginning of the .com. It just seems like the same thing. I think we're going to build overcapacity, and eventually the internet created a whole lot of new businesses that we could never have imagined. But there was an awful lot of stumbles along the way. And right now I feel the same thing. I always think back to reading historically when the railroads were being built in America. It was a similar thing. There were tons of railroad companies until finally sustainable business models emerged and people could see where this is going. Mark, what do you see looking forward in the future? What are the things that excite you for your business in the Indian market?
I think we see stronger and stronger deep tech companies at the intersection of deep tech, emerging technologies, manufacturing, and building hardware and material and life sciences solutions for the climate crisis. We've done a bunch of deals in that space. We're going to do even more. But India is going through its own version of a manufacturing renaissance right now. Having previously sort of been content to let China dominate that space, India is really making a play. And so the quality of the founding teams that we're seeing coming into manufacturing related businesses that are working on physical solutions to the climate crisis are the highest they've ever been. That's something that we're pretty excited about right now.
Mark, I think we've almost gotten to the finish line here. I've got some short answer, rapid fire questions for you before we wrap up. Don't overthink these and just give me whatever comes to your mind. Or if nothing does, feel free to take a pass. You can also do that. If you had to name the single most important challenge in the AgriTech and climate smart venture capital space at this time, what would it be?
Growth stage capital.
What do you know now about AgriTech and impact VC investing that you wish you knew back in 2010 or 2011 when you co-founded Omnivore?
It's all about backing brilliant entrepreneurs. Ideas matter much less than the people building them.
There's lots of good ideas out there. You got to execute. This is an investor podcast. You don't have to name names, but can you describe an investment that you made that you were convinced of at the time you invested that it ticked all your impact boxes, but in the end, it didn't turn out and went pear-shaped? And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
I can think of many examples, and they all almost always come down to backing an entrepreneur that was the wrong horse to bet on, because that person did not understand how to find product market fit or didn't understand how to build teams to scale.
And now the converse of that, can you describe an investment that you had some level of skepticism about, either at the time you invested or maybe you ultimately passed on it, and in the end, this thing blew up and turned out way better than you could have imagined, and you were pleased that you invested, or if you had passed on it, you regretted it? And what was the lesson learned from that experience?
I can think of two companies that we passed on that we consider to be like our 2 points, our two biggest anti-portfolios. And the interesting thing is they were both founded by investment bankers. And we were skeptical that investment bankers could build a large business. And we should have been smarter than that, and so should have seen the value of that investment banking background insofar as what you learn how to do in that context that allows you to build a big business.
But just to pick your brain on that lesson, one of your first answers was picking the right person.
We didn't think a former investment banker was the right person to build a large agribusiness company. And I can think of two founded by former investment bankers that have been phenomenal.
Your thesis, it's probably better to stick with that.
I think it's more about just understanding the value of different kinds of talent, depending on what you're building.
And was the way that they built that, perhaps the way they executed, were they just exceptional, bringing in people who did have the operational?
Or in one case, exceptional at roll-ups because they had done lots of transactions.
Yeah, that makes sense. If someone wants to get into the AgriTech and climate smart VC investing space, where would you advise them?
Don't, because that's not a career. That's just not a career. I've had people reach out to me being like, how do I do this? And I'm like, I see myself as an agribusiness professional who happened to become an investor, but I still see myself first and foremost as an agribusiness professional. That was the passion that I fixated on before graduate school and have stuck with all of this time. And I have been an investor for a long time. Maybe one day I'll decide that corporate is great, or maybe one day I'll become an entrepreneur. Who knows? Or I'll stick to doing this the rest of my life. But I think for me, the passion is the passion for agri. I think if you have that, do that, and then it doesn't matter what you do, you'll enjoy it. I think the space of like agri-food VC is so small that if you told me you wanted to have a career in it, I would laugh.
And you think it's going to continue to be that much of a niche?
I think it's a small part of VC, and that's okay.
Mark, this has been fascinating for me. Your journey from Houston to Mumbai has certainly been interesting. You've sure got a lot of stories to tell, and I really learned a lot today. So thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking a deep dive with us. And before we wrap up here, tell everyone where they can find out about all the great things you guys are doing at Omnivore and connect with the work that you're doing.
You can go on our website. You can go on our LinkedIn, which is probably even better than our website. If you go on our website, sign up for our Substack, you'll learn about everything.
And your website is omnivore.vc?
Yeah, www.omnivore.vc, correct.
And if someone wants to reach out to you, to contact you, what's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn is the easiest way to do it, or we have email form on our website that actually will be read by a partner always. We're pretty obsessed about that.
Excellent. So if you want to contact Mark, reach out on LinkedIn, and everyone should definitely check out omnivore.vc to check out what they're doing. So Mark, thanks again for coming on. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure being here.
Goodbye, everybody.
You've been listening to SRI 360. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and subscribe to get future episodes. You can find an archive of all previous podcast interviews and more articles and information on SRI, ESG, impact investing, sustainable investing, and socially responsible investing at our website, sri360.com. If you'd like to read more lessons learned from world-class SRI investors, get a copy of Scott Arnell's book, Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360. It's a must-read for anyone wanting to know more about investing for positive social, environmental, and ethical impact. all with market financial returns. These are the stories and tactics of those leading the way as sustainable and responsible investing goes mainstream. Sustainable and Responsible Investing 360 is now available in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook format wherever books are sold.